this Tuesday afternoon. Good to talk to you. Thank you so very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me again.
I wish we could share information about the latest Manitoba hospital test positivity data perhaps from our sewage treatment plants on the latest where COVID is, but the government's not sharing that, certainly not on a daily basis. We will get a weekly update starting tomorrow. Is that, in your view, problematic?
It's not good. I mean, you can't make evidence-based decisions without evidence. So I'm not sure what's motivating these kinds of decisions except for possibly the conservation of resources, administrative resources. But that strikes me as a poor excuse. More transparency is what we need, not less.
I'm not saying that they're not collecting the data, that they don't have the data. They're simply not sharing the data.
That's even
So
more
then,
worrying. Yeah, that's even more
so then
worrying.
does COVID go away then? If it's not there, if it's not shared, I gather COVID disappears then, doesn't it, Ray Watt?
That's clearly how it seems to be working. I don't know what to say. I mean, it, we
Are
have
other jurisdictions doing the same thing, right?
not
What you're
quite.
seeing across the country?
Not quite as brazenly, but there is a movement across the country to share less. But to actually say that we have the data, but we're not going to give it to you, is another story entirely. And I can't think of what the motivation might be, except to say we don't trust citizen scientists to do their own analyses. And that's a problem because most scientists, except the ones working directly with the government, are essentially citizen scientists who rely upon the open sharing of this information to get things done. Open data is a movement across all of science right now. Open, transparent sharing of information is the trajectory we've all been on, and to have that reversed on us is not good. It's worrying.
Well, and especially when you hear Cynthia Carr and others saying, like, we got educated. The average person was following along, was tracking this. They were using that to assess their own risk, particularly if they were elderly or have an underlying health condition like most people do.
Yeah, it's almost condescending and patronizing to the common citizen to say, well, we can't trust you with this information to understand it correctly, so we won't give it to you. What we need is more openness, more transparency, more context, more science education to assist those who struggle with understanding it, but also trust in the public. Because 2 years into this, everyone has had a crash course in how to understand a lot of this data, and they're doing a pretty good job of it. So she's absolutely correct. I agree with her 100%.
Now, the federal government did release some wastewater data, and if people aren't going to get it from the province, they will search for other resources. And I found on Twitter somebody saying, here, listen, this is what the federal government is showing, and it appears to show a bit of a rise in the south end of Winnipeg, not so much in the north end of Winnipeg. How much stock can you put in, well, the wastewater that's being collected?
Given that we don't have good testing, given that only some people have access to PCR, given that people aren't reporting their rapid antigen testing results, wastewater testing is the most objective, consistent method we have for surveillance. That and something we call sentinel surveillance, which is when in a hospital they may test everybody who walks through the door. So we have to rely upon it. It's not perfect. You don't get people using the septic system, for example. You don't get adults who are using diapers, for example. Not to be flippant about this, but it's not going to sample everybody. And depending on which variant is circulating, the amount of viral signal to trigger some sort of public health crisis may differ as well. But again, the trend lines are useful. It shows us, especially if the wastewater signal is correlated with hospital admissions, that's a useful kind of observation.
The RCMP inspector involved in that international drug investigation launched here in Winnipeg joins us in 8 minutes. Ray Watt Deonandan from the University of Ottawa is with us on 680 CJOB. And let's go to Europe first of all, because we're starting to see numbers there on the Omicron and the subvariant of Omicron starting to explode there, aren't we?
We are. Now, is that our future? It's hard to say, but we have tended to follow what we see in Europe fairly closely. BA2, the subvariant of Omicron, is more contagious. Is it more serious? It does not appear to be. It seems to be on par. And it looks like any immunity gathered from the first Omicron might be transferable to BA2, though maybe not to other variants. That's all still iffy. The data is not complete or thorough, but that's the best we have to go on. It looks like much of Canada is going to enter a sixth wave driven by this BA2 subvariant.
So, but if it's more like flu and cold. Can't we just treat it that way? And that's the argument for really not sharing all that information, because we don't share all the information that we would have on various ailments. Is there an argument to be made on that somehow, that we have to somehow normalize this as opposed to compartmentalize this?
Is it more like cold and flu, though? Perhaps for the heavily vaccinated, for a segment of the population, yes, but we still have a portion of the population that cannot be vaccinated. I'm talking here about the kids under 5. For them, this is not the cold and flu. If they get it, they run a risk that is higher than that of the flu. So I don't think it's right to think about this as the flu quite yet. But it's not wrong to say that we are in a different position now than we were, say, a year or a year and a half ago, because vaccination has changed the calculus profoundly. You're probably not going to be hospitalized or die if you're triply vaxxed and taking the appropriate precautions. But to use that as a rationale for not sharing information strikes me as condescending and paternalizing.
Speaking of vaccination, FDA today saying people 50 and up can have a 4th shot, a second booster, if you will, 4 months after their 3rd shot of either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines. Is that a good idea, given the fact that these formulas haven't really changed to address any of the variants?
It's a good question. I haven't given it a lot of deep thought, to be honest, but my first response would be it's a little early to make that a directive. 3rd doses are still relatively new in us, and it may sustain protection for a very long period of time. If we're going to be looking at a 4th dose, maybe in a few months, probably not now. The vaccine efficacy for 3 doses is pretty good, and I would rather wait for a 4th dose that is tailor-made for new variants, or at least has a multivalent formulation. But all that would change if we're suddenly knee-deep in some crisis and we need that additional push of population immunity. But right now, my position is it's probably too early.
It's a good idea to remind people to get those 3rd doses, because there's a dramatic difference between those that have 2 and those that have 3. Ray Dewnandan, always appreciate popping on and sharing some of your time and expertise with us.
Thank you very much.